Hello, everybody. My name is Dan Tucker. I was the senior producer on a BBC VR documentary called Easter Rising Voice of a Rebel, which is downstairs. If you haven't seen it, please go and see it. And I'm now also the curator for something called Alternate Realities, which is the VR and interactive program for the Sheffield International Documentary Festival. So I'm here to talk to you about VR documentary making. And in this talk, I'm going to tell you a little bit about my experience, give you a few tips if you need or want them. I'm going to talk a little bit, very quickly, about what Sheffield Documentary Festival does in the world of VR. And then I'm going to make some recommendations. I'm going to try to make this as useful as I can for you guys. And we'll start with, I like the intimate gathering. We'll start with a little bit of interaction, if that's okay. So if you work in virtual reality, please put up your hand. Great. And if you are a documentary filmmaker or work in documentary, please put up your hand. Thank fuck for that. Great. So there are some people interested in both worlds. So that image there is an image from a Dziga Vertov film, which I was turned on to by the guy who I worked on my VR documentary with, and I'm going to talk about him in a minute. But I'm going to start, because I'm British, with a complaint. I'm going to complain about VR. So VR is a wonderful medium, but we spend far too long talking about VR as a technology. Everything that's wrong with the perception of VR is in this horrendous composite image. This is Palmer Luckey, the 20-something-year-old man behind the Oculus Rift. That's great. But what is going on here? Is he at the beach? Do we believe he's at the beach? Does he believe he's at the beach? Why is he taking his shoes off? There's a headset. No one knows what's really going on. And then it promises that it's about to change the world, yet we have no real insight into how powerful the medium is. All we're doing is looking from the outside in. When I started working at the BBC as the digital editor of history, I made a bunch of different immersive and interactive stories, not in VR. To be honest, I was very skeptical about VR, and it's images like this that make lots of people like me super skeptical about VR. But as you can imagine, I changed my tune. And it was the work of several people, actually some of the people who are here today, that changed my opinion. I'd like to highlight three particular examples. In the top left corner is a film called Ascent by Oscar Raby, who is the VR director and artist I went on to work with. On the top right-hand corner is Clouds Over Cedar, which is Gabbo's work, and Gabbo was here talking earlier. And really, Clouds Over Cedar was the Beatles moment in VR for me. And down the bottom is a grab from Evolution of Verse, which is one of Chris Milk's pieces. And what this shows you is what's inside the headset. It shows you how incredible, how unique those experiences can be, and how they can touch you and completely change your mindset. But the BBC's history with making VR goes way back to 2014, which in VR is a bit like dog years, is about like 15 years now, even though it's only 3. And this piece, I saw this piece, and this was another influencer for me. It's available for cardboard, and it was the first piece, it's a very short piece, where I had seen a powerful bit of commentary. It was a war poem from Sigrid Sassoon, and it used visual cues to move my eye to where the makers wanted me to look, and I thought that was clever. The second piece that the BBC went on to make was Rome's Invisible City, a web VR project in 2015. And web VR is still nascent, very new technology. But this showed how you could scan real environments and create worlds. So this was my first experience of really seeing the world unknown to me start to develop around me. And I was completely taken aback by how powerful that experience was, stepping back into history. And then in 2016, the BBC made We Wait, which was made by Aardman Studios, who are an amazing game studio, animation studio. They made a story about a migrant journey from Turkey to Cyprus, but with these really polygonic, kind of childlike figures. And that made me realize, actually, things don't need to be super photorealistic. You don't need high resolution to go on an amazing story. And then, as my friend and colleague Tom Burton mentioned earlier, there was Home Spacewalk, which was a huge jump forward into a very, very powerful, visceral experience, this time photorealistic, in which the BBC took you into space. And then there was the project that I worked on, where we took you back in time. Easter Rising Voice of a Rebel is a story about memory. It's one man's experience of living through a rebellion. I know in France you have a long history of revolution, but in the UK there was only one real revolution, and that was the Easter Rising of 1916, 100 years ago, last year. And we made this piece to preserve the memory of one man's experience of a hugely important event in Irish and UK history. It was made for the Rift, which is downstairs, and the Gear VR, and it's going to be released in the Oculus stores on the 6th of July. So it was the first real VR documentary that was made in real-time technology using Unreal. It was the true story of a man that was found in a lost piece of archive. And it's a tale of youth and rebellion, which I think everyone can relate to now. Like young men and women are swept up in violent revolutions, rebellions, insurgency all over the world now. And just like everything that you'll see here and at other festivals, we're still in a very experimental era of VR. So this was an experiment with narrative and interaction. And I'd just like to show you the trailer.
Much has been spoken and written over the years about the rising of 1916. I myself had a small adventure, which I think I should relate.
So there you get a taste of the experience. So this story is really the story of two men, separated geographically, separated by many years. This is Oscar Raby, and Oscar Raby is a visual artist who I work with on this project. And as I mentioned before, I'd seen his film Ascent, and I was deeply moved by his film. I was surprised and shocked that actually I could experience a story in VR that really stayed with me, a series of moments that I remembered for days afterwards. So I pursued, some might say stalked, I pursued Oscar, and we arranged a call, and I said, listen, I'm the digital editor of history, I really want to do something in VR, maybe something around World War I. And he said, well, I've got a story from 100 years ago. I was at a folk club in Camden in London, as you do, and I met this guy at the bar, and we're talking about our love of history, and this guy in the bar says, you know, about 6 months ago, we found this tape cassette, like an old 1980s tape cassette in the attic. And it's my grandfather talking about his memories of living through the Easter Rising, the only real revolution on British soil, 100 years ago, from 2016 to 1916. And I was like, wow, that sounds great, dude. Send it over. We read through it together, and it, blow by blow, walks you through his experience. So it's perfect for a kind of POV embodiment experience. And the other person is, of course, the man himself, William McNeve. So William McNeve was a 19-year-old dreamer, a rebel, and he got swept up in this very dangerous situation and escaped with his life through a twist of fate. And I won't say any more because I'd like you to go and watch the film. I don't want to spoil it for you. So Oscar and I worked together to make a documentary about his memories and make that accessible to a wide audience. As you can see, it's a very kind of stylized look, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the process of how we developed the look, the feel, the aesthetic, and how we literally did step back in time to achieve the aesthetic we wanted. So I've mentioned before, this was an armed, dangerous situation. Young men, I know they don't look very young, but they really are quite young, they were swept up in. And we stepped back in time, we said, well, we want this to feel of the moment. We want it to feel early 20th century. So we referenced music of the time, we referenced sound recordings of the time, but most of all, we referenced art of the time. And you'll see this very fragmented look is purposeful. It comes from an art movement called Vorticism, which is a Cubist movement in the early 20th century. And we use that to influence the look of the piece. Here's one of the early sketches of the famous charge in Moore Street at the end of the film. Here's another wonderful piece of First World War art that we used to influence our structures and silhouettes. But we also used imagery from 2016, fragmentation, to develop our characters. And going back to that, this fragmentation is really important. Like when you imagine this guy, he recorded his memories of the Easter Rising when he was in his 80s. Like memory across that many years is fragmented. We would remember faces, but everything at the edges would just fade away or become fragmented. So we exchanged, they were working on Australia, by the way, and I was working in London, but we exchanged lots of emails and we worked in Basecamp. And for those of you who understand this process, we had an agile, iterative process where we kept releasing new builds, shared lots of art reference, worked, you can see these little gray men there, worked with a kind of gray box prototype where we mapped out the movement first, and then slowly but surely, like layers of paint, made the piece, the art piece. And one way that we found that was really effective to quickly communicate ideas around the aesthetic was just to share little GIFs. So we would be pinging little GIFs to each other about like, how about the street comes alive like this? Or if we want to use archive, can we layer on top of each other and allow you to move around it? And in the case of Willie and his memories, can we find a metaphor for memory? He's recorded it on a tape deck, so why don't we use the tape as the metaphor for memory? Now, as I said before, I'd like to try and impart some knowledge. So here's a lot of text. I'll try and rattle through it, or just take a picture if you're interested. So some of the techniques I learned about VR making, I have a mixed background. I came from making television documentary, but I've also made websites and games. But this was really different. I had to take that television toolbox and put it to one side. And some of the most immediate and the quickest things I learned about making a VR documentary with impact was to use scale. Scale immediately makes you feel more immersed. And we were lucky that we had this great first-person account, so embodiment was perfect for our piece and was very powerful. And having the narration of the actor Liam Cunningham revoicing his words was also a real boon. There are several things that I think make VR really special. One of them is presence, feeling present within the experience. And we used reflections of the self and other characters reacting to you and looking at you to really amplify that. And the biggest learning for me was, coming from a documentary film background, was pace. Everything had to be slowed down because there's no guarantee that the person's going to look at what you want them to look at. They're going to be over here. So you need a slower pace to allow them to explore the scenes, to give them that agency. And here is like the final realization of William McNeve with the tape recorder. You might be able to just see there, it says Dublin 1978. So there's things I had to learn the hard way. I tried to impose loads of things on Oscar, which he pushed back on. Turned out he was right and I was totally fucking wrong. So you can't really storyboard in a linear way. In fact, VR, unlike a series of flat images that passes in front of your face, is a bit like you're the line passing through a series of baubles, of globes. You move through a series of moments in which you're able to interact or have the agency to look around. And you want to make each of those little hanging balls as powerful as possible, make them really powerful memories, but find ways to transition between them really elegantly. That's a real difference. And a lot of the kind of toolbox editing norms, certainly in our first experimentation of VR, just wouldn't work. You can't really do the close-ups that you would do in a linear documentary. You can't jump cut. Coverage doesn't really work. And the lens is now your eyes. So you have to think really carefully about where you position that camera. And movement, we all know this. You know, you have to be very careful with movement. We want to challenge the viewer, we want to challenge their perspective, we want to challenge their ideas, but we don't want to challenge their stomach. And then the biggest learning is authorship over the frame. So this is for everyone making narrative VR. You've got to let the audience in, and you've got to accept that they're going to look around and kind of do what they want. But there were things that really did work. And taking time to know the storyteller. In the experience, we introduce you to William McNeve, the old man at the beginning, and you have time to kind of be in this kind of memory palace where he's remembering his story. And as I said before with War of Words, guiding the visitor, using the tape, which is the metaphor for memory, to just lead your eye, or sometimes aural cues like audio to pull your attention, or even just sometimes the subtle things like the shaders in Unity, the little vibrations, like put them in the corner because we want you to look up there and see the flag waving. Transitions were a very important part of this piece. And I learned a lot from Oscar. And there were loads of transition ideas that he suggested that I thought were so cheesy. They were really kind of, oh, you can't do that in a documentary. But actually they work very elegantly in VR. And you'll see that from the kind of wipes and the iris moving in. I'm a big fan of Ambiguity, or am I? Full stop. But certainly that is the friend of VR. Things don't need to be literal. Don't need to be photorealistic, don't need to be defined. I get loads of feedback about Easter Rising where people say, that's a great story, man, but like, what's going on with the way you've like the visual aesthetic, like what's going on with that? Like, was it because it was cheaper? No, it was purposeful. Your brain doesn't care that the person in front of you is made up of tiny triangles. They care about what's happening between you and that person and the story you're hearing. And then this is one for perhaps a drink in the bar and a chat, but balancing VR is actually really key. Like if you've ever made a game, you know you have to balance the game at the end, right? Or maybe you don't, I don't know. But it's the same with VR. You have to have the right balance of intensity, the right balance of empathy. You want people to feel emotionally engaged and affected, but we need them to continue listening to the narrative and understand the story and and cognitively engage with the information we're giving as well. So this is one of the kind of final stills from the film, and one I really love, and I think just expresses like how dynamic the film is, how powerful it is, and also this kind of sense of danger. And it has all those elements I talked about before, like the fragments of memory. So to cut to the kind of end of the story, so Easter Rising launched on June the 9th. We finished the project on June the 9th, and we took it to the Sheffield International Documentary Festival. There's no coincidence that I am now working there. Since then, it's been to, in fact, more than 24. It's about 30 films. It's actually been to more countries around the world, I think, than I have. And it's been received really well. And we also worked really hard to get this in front of people because working for the BBC, where you're publicly funded, we needed to put this in front of an audience. And I don't know whether you agree with this, but I certainly think that the way people are going to see VR is at events like this and other location-based opportunities. So we had a great partnership with the National Theatre in London, where they were showing a play about the Easter Rising. So you had this wonderful moment of like high culture play, and a much older crowd coming and then seeing VR, and really seeing a great unity between the two artistic endeavors. And we also showed it at the Imperial War Museum, which is a very big museum in both Manchester and London. That was across about 5 months, and I think maybe about 6,000 to 7,000 people saw it across those two venues. And if you add up everyone that's seen it around all the festivals and conferences, etc., it must be around 30 or 40,000 people now. And we made it available online for free to download from the BBC Taster website. So if you've got the kit, you can download it. But as I said before, on the 6th of July, very soon, it's going to come to the Gear VR store and the Rift store. So that was the project. I whizzed through it, but I want to leave some time for questions because I think we should interact with each other. I'm just going to say a little bit about my new gig, Sheffield Doc Fest. So as the VR curator, I have an international showcase of VR. I have a one-day summit, a bit like this, for digital storytellers. And we have an international marketplace. So for those project makers or commissioners or people who want to get projects off the ground, come and talk to me because we have a really interesting and active marketplace. And just a few little pictures. So this is a great documentary called Blindfold from Ink Studios, the guys who made 1979 Revolution. They were here this year with us. It's a really powerful piece. The Guardian was also there for their Guardian VR project, First Impressions, where you see through the eyes of a baby. And we, for the first time, had a dome. And actually, in terms of documentary, VR documentary with impact, this has an incredible impact. You're able to see it communally. And people would come out, complete strangers would come out and immediately have a communal discussion about the content they've seen. So I'm just going to wrap up actually with a few recommendations about things I think are worth you going out to see or find, and some of them are here. That's purposeful. So Indefinite is a film that's showing here, made by a guy called Darren Emerson, who's a friend of mine. It's a really, really good and very powerful 360 video VR film. Seek it out. And The Incredible Death Tolls, Ali Aslami, who unfortunately couldn't be here because of his visa situation. This guy is so talented, and if you get a chance to watch a film, apart from my film, please do go and watch both of those. And it was mentioned earlier today by Nonny, After Solitary. I took a big shout out to this piece. I saw it at South by. This is an amazing piece. Photogrammetry has captured the environment. You can even look underneath the bed. And then volumetrically with video, they've captured the protagonist, so you can walk around a piece of video. You know, I see a lot of VR in my current job, and at South by Southwest, I went to sit down on his bed. His bed doesn't exist. I fell on my ass. I was so immersed that I was so taken in by the photogrammetry that I fell over. So that's it from me. I'd just like to end with a quote which inspired me to want to make the VR documentary as well, which is about identity and history. Identities are formed at the unstable point where personal lives meet the narrative of history, and identity is an ever unfinished conversation, and we should continue to explore that in VR. Thank you.